right, let's just let the live stream start and we'll hit record through the magic of technology. We'll be on our way. Well, welcome everyone to another Massachusetts Peace Action webinar. Today, we will be talking about Ukraine and asking an incredibly important question that we have all been puzzling ourselves with. And it's also the title of our guest's article that spurred so much conversation and interest. That question, of course, is why are we in Ukraine? So we're now about a year and a half since the escalation of the war in Ukraine, since the Russian invasion. And we're trying to figure out a way to end the bloodshed, end this war as soon as possible, and push things to the negotiating table. Our guest today, Benjamin Schwarz, has wrote an article about 6 weeks ago, I believe, that looked at a lot of the conveniently forgotten history that led up to this escalation, to this full-blown war in Ukraine. And through looking at the history, we think that there's a lot of clues as to how we can get out of this, find a way back to peace. So we're incredibly honored to have Benjamin with us. Benjamin Schwarz was literary and national editor of The Atlantic. The Los Angeles Times wrote that he had reshaped the venerable magazine's book section into the shrewdest, best written, and most surprising cultural report currently on offer between slick covers. How about that for an introduction? And like I said, he is also the author, along with Professor Christopher Layne, of the article that appeared in Harper's magazine, and that is Why Are We in Ukraine? So with that, I'd like to introduce our guest, Benjamin Schwarz.
Well, Brian, I'm just so delighted to be with you, and you're doing really important, really vital work. And if I can help in any way inform your campaign, I'm honored. So thank you very much for having me.
Well, we really do appreciate it. Our philosophy here at Massachusetts Peace Action and in the Peace in Ukraine campaign specifically is to educate and to use education to spur action and advocacy. So that's what we're going to be doing tonight. The first thing that I wanted to ask you is, it hasn't been too long since this article came out, but a lot has happened just in that time. I believe you wrote in the article that just as it was going to press, Finland had just joined NATO. Now we're seeing another expansion of NATO. I just wanted to give you a chance to update us very, very quickly about the last 6 weeks.
That's probably going to be briefer than would be ideal. You all probably have been in some ways following the news over the last 6 weeks more closely than I have. I've just been preoccupied with a number of things, but I would say that everyone that I have talked to, the prospect of a negotiated settlement seems as remote now as unfortunately as when we published that article, I think there are signs on the one hand, I think there are signs among certain parties in the West of not so much war weariness, but a justifiable concern that there doesn't seem to be, to use the oft-quoted metaphor, an off-ramp. Now, usually that's used to describe how the West is going to force Moscow into an off-ramp. But there doesn't seem to be an off-ramp on, for either party. So I think on the one hand, there's more concern and pessimism within certain elements, both of the U.S. national security establishment and among decision makers in Western Europe, but that their very concern and pessimism points to the real difficulties that are going to be involved in ending this conflict. As a matter of fact, someone I spoke to last night about this, really feared something in some ways a combination of the First World War and the Cold War in that. And I think that there will be the First World War in that there is really a stalemate in military terms. And it's a long-term stalemate. Neither party is really going to be able to achieve its stated aims. And as is always familiar with wars, as wars drag on and costs increase, on the one hand, there is an element of exhaustion. On the other hand, there's also an element of sunk costs, that people, so that the First World War part of it and the Cold War part of it is that and what's behind this is that it's really difficult to see any possibility of a relaxation of tensions, political tensions between Washington and Moscow. And I'm going to be using throughout Washington often to describe the West's position, to describe NATO's position, because I think it's important to just acknowledge the fact that the United States regards itself and acts as the leader of the alliance, and nothing really happens without nothing of importance happens without the United States' sanction. So we even saw this recently with President Biden's effective veto of the next Secretary General of NATO. Now, the Secretary General that was going to be that the UK wanted, and that some other parties in Western Europe wanted, Ben Wallace, was not was not a dove in any way. For other reasons, the United States didn't want Ben Wallace, but the United States got its way, and it's one thing, and we can discuss this further, but it's very important to sort of understand and acknowledge that that NATO really is the means by which the United States exercises its influence and preponderant influence in European security and European security matters. So.
And I think another, and I know that you've written on the Great War extensively, World War I. I think another analogy, unfortunately, is this position of both sides that they're not willing to telegraph what appropriate conditions for the war ending would be. It seems Ukraine is continuing to put out the position that it will take every inch back of its territory. Washington and NATO, by extension, is saying that we're in this for the long haul, whatever it takes, and maintaining the fact that Ukraine will inevitably become a member of NATO. How do you see that in terms of Russia's position, and if those continue to be points that both sides hold to, how can we get to the negotiating table?
Right. Well, I mean, and this is something I hope will emerge in the discussion. In that I do see the origins of the war as complex and multifaceted as they are, is that ultimately can be located in the desire of the United States to ultimately to incorporate NATO, rather Ukraine into the alliance, into NATO, and Russia's opposition to that. And the problem is that, and this is going back to what we were just talking about, it's going to, that is just anathema to Moscow. On the other hand, it's both, and well, from the Ukrainian point of view, I could see, especially now, that the territory has been invaded. It is the a terrible war is being conducted in its territory, that it isn't going to be satisfied with anything short of some sort of security guarantee. And it's very difficult to imagine what party would proffer that security guarantee other than the alliance, other than NATO. And also from Washington's point of view, I think it's the way that it has portrayed Russia. It can't really climb down. If this is, this is in some ways a very familiar pattern, as we know. There's a tendency among figures in Washington and in the media to ascribe the absolutely most horrible motives to our adversaries. And if you regard Moscow as in the terms that the Biden administration has described Moscow, it would be, if nothing else, domestically, politically, very difficult for the Biden administration to back down. By the way, in some ways, it just so happens that the Biden administration is in power. This would be true, certainly if any of the leading Republican candidates gain the presidency as well, except, well, with the possible and complicated exception of Trump. But actually, well, I would say no. I think some could argue, and I think in some ways there is and I don't want to go into this is like, this is all speculation, but some people do make the argument that Ukraine will see that it's better to make a deal now than risk making a deal if Donald Trump is elected, and that there might be more pressure to make a deal that would not be in as Kiev defines its interest. I don't know. I think that just the possibility that as we've whatever, and it was always incredibly complicated to discern exactly what Trump was saying, what his stated position on all sorts of issues were. But when push came to shove, they, resembled his policy responses were not in any way revolutionary or significantly different from what to put it in too crudely, the foreign policy establishment or the national security establishment would have advanced. But again, that's all in the realm of speculation. I'm happy to speculate, but I'm probably in most ways less informed than you all are on a lot of those issues.
Well, to that point, despite what the media would have us believe, and I think what a lot of mainstream opinion is about Donald Trump and his relationship with Russia, we see several escalations that actually increased tensions between the U.S. and Russia that took place under Donald Trump.
Absolutely,
I mean,
absolutely. Yes.
The INF treaty, sending heavier weapons to Ukraine, weapons, in fact, that President Obama was unwilling to send.
Yes.
And that gets into my next question. Very few, well, zero Democrats recently have been willing to break with the Biden administration on his position of practically unlimited support for this war in Ukraine. But I'm remembering the interview that President Obama did, I believe it was in The Atlantic, back in 2015, when he talked about the dangers of getting more involved and the escalation ladder. Where are voices like that on the left, or even in the center, that are preaching caution about this war?
Well, that's a great question, and it's a question really that I wanted to ask you all. And you raise a lot of very important points. I'll deal with the sort of the larger point, but I do want to get specifically to some issues you raised about President Obama's specifically. I fear. Well, look, I was just talking the other day with a very prominent figure on the British left, and by left, did not intellectual left, not his no political position, no political office, and I was arguing that, certainly within, I think absolutely within the United States, but I think more generally, the response in Europe that there has been what it has been. I really believe that it's impossible to explain that without reference to Donald Trump. In that, I think, as in so many aspects of American political life, he's just has been a poisonous and toxic influence. By that, and I'm not in some ways being unduly harsh to Donald Trump when I say that, because I'm going to, for the sake of my argument, I'll just be agnostic as to what Donald Trump's quote true beliefs and policy preferences are. I do believe that his instincts, and I think instincts are important, were in some ways, interestingly, resembled, and neither of these figures would like this, in some ways resembled President Obama's. I think he certainly made noises, and going very far back in his political career, that it seemed he didn't, and in this blunt and crude way, just sort of he would sort of signal that what's the why are we doing this? Why are we making Russia into an enemy? Now, again, I want to distinguish between whatever those statements were and the actual policies that he followed. Of course, you can make the same distinctions with President Obama to an extent, but I think I think to some extent the the media and Trump's allies and enemies are correct in sort of identifying his instincts as being, to put it way too crudely, not more, I don't want to use the word, a little more accommodationist as far as relations with Russia go. So therefore, those of us who are old enough can identify, can see the resemblance to the Cold War. Anyone who makes an argument for an accommodationist position with Moscow, anyone who is making the argument that the United States is, to one extent or another, itself to blame, or at least there's a large element of fault for this current conflict that can be laid at Washington's doorstep. Anyone who makes that argument is regarded as, in some way, Trumpian. And I think for the left in this country, that is just that is anathema. That is just such you want to distance yourself from that. So that, and it's difficult to identify, and define what we mean by the left. I would say, for instance, on college campuses, to the extent that I've had dealings with students, etc., how they define themselves politically is almost entirely in opposition to Donald Trump. And that they are extremely hawkish on this war. And so, and again, I'm not in any way trying to applaud. I don't know. As I said, I want to just be agnostic. I don't know let's just pretend I don't know what Trump really believes.
I'm not sure he does.
Of course.
I'm not sure he does, to be completely honest. I think there's a lot of, putting his finger up in the air and seeing which way the wind is blowing.
Yes, absolutely. But because to put it again too crudely, the quote anti-war position is so,
I never did speak, idiot.
I'm sorry?
I don't, I think that was a little background noise. I would ask everyone to mute themselves, and I believe they should stay muted. So continue, please.
But again, I think it's really difficult to, understand the response to this war without taking Donald Trump into account. I think it's really from my way of thinking, it's almost governed the response. And unfortunately, in some ways, this isn't new. I mean, I remember during the Iraq War, I was, because I was very much against the Iraq War, and I did, though, find myself often arguing with my allies of the time, because it seemed to me that I would ask this, well, where were you, with the Clinton administration's interventions, specifically with Kosovo, and it seemed to me that a lot of the opposition to the Gulf War. And a lot of what I mean by that is there were arguments made that were kind of what I consider sort of my arguments. They were, and we can discuss this because they're not entirely, I think, the arguments that some of you would make. I do consider myself a foreign policy realist. And that people were making realist foreign policy arguments in opposition to the Gulf War, which I think was absolutely correct. But they weren't making those realist foreign policy arguments. They were making quite the opposite in defense of the Clinton administration, the Clinton administration's policies. So, for a long time now, and I don't think there's anything necessarily new about this, but the way people respond to a foreign policy intervention of the United States is largely governed by who happens to be in power. That's a little unsettling, and it's a little bit difficult to make principled arguments. But again, I think the case of Donald Trump is just it is just huge that people who would otherwise see at least be very cautious and skeptical about the West response, feel almost that they have to, be extremely enthusiastic and belligerent, because So I'll just leave it at that for now.
And I agree. I think partisanship has a great deal to do with it. In the recent debates over amendments to the National Defense Authorization Act, we're hearing folks like Marjorie Taylor Greene lead against cluster munitions, which is a peace position. And I think many people are surprised to see that. I chalk it up to partisanship, I suppose. But another example of that that's a little different is the feigned ignorance of some folks that are even in the Biden administration. I'm thinking specifically of CIA Director William Burns, who you discuss in your article, who we know he knows better because it's in writing. But this claim that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was an unprovoked act seems to be a statement that they just cannot let go of, even those that have shown in the past that they certainly know better.
Yes, and I would say it's to bring back a point you raised about President Obama. I would say that that the kind of normal differences and conflicts and debates that one would see within an administration or within a political party or even within a certain political persuasion are largely absent from this debate. So that I think just as President Obama's instincts were much more cautious and skeptical than those of a lot of people in his party and a lot of people in his administration. I think his administration was really divided. You had, to put it really crudely, President Obama on one side, but his vice president, his then Vice President Joe Biden, his Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, Samantha Power, our ambassador to the UN, what is her? Susan Rice. They were all on the sort of the other side of things, as was, of course, someone who was I think as was, say, Victoria Nuland, who has served both the
she worked for Dick Cheney at one time.
Yes, she worked for Dick Cheney. Let's see, was she? I think she was serving under President Obama, but I'm not.
Oh, she certainly was.
Yeah. Okay, and she's certainly obviously serving under Joe Biden. So there has been a lot of it. No political party has spoken with one voice about this. There have been and those more accommodationist elements, I think, within the Democratic Party and within the administration and within the national security structure, have been sort of drowned and overwhelmed. I heard from some people, in positions and not political appointees, but people who serve in the various agencies and departments who've expressed agreement with the points we raised in that in the Harper's article. But they say, it's you just can't. That level of dissent is just there's a real clampdown on that, and that hasn't always been the case. I mean, I even remember going back to the debates about El Salvador specifically. There was a lot of, I mean, now again, this didn't rise to the level of people within the Reagan administration debating this publicly, but there was debate both within the Reagan administration itself and certainly within the CIA and the State Department about American policy toward El Salvador, and that was understood and known, even if it wasn't, people didn't go on record. This is an unusually this is an unusually monolithic period in some ways in terms of domestic policy. You have people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who for their own eccentric reasons, and again, I don't want to actually, I shouldn't really ascribe motive. There are a lot of people who maybe for their own eccentric reasons, are voicing or some people who are voicing more accommodationist arguments, but those people are, for the most part, excluded from their political party's establishment. There's nothing like, and this is something I'd love to hear, your thoughts about. I'm alas older than I wish I were, but I'm not. I was raised in a politically very active household, so my memory of Vietnam is actually quite clear. There was you had a sense, even in the semi-early days, that there were real, figures of real national importance who were questioning that war, there was not a sense that questioning that war, and this is when there was a Cold War, it by definition put you in the enemy's camp. And I know that there was opposition to a lot of American Cold War policy generally, that was tolerated, regarded as respectable, that wouldn't be regarded as respectable today. That there's the automatic sense that if you're making these arguments, you are making Putin's talking points. That is, sure. And there was certainly that during the Cold War, but there seemed to me, except maybe in the very darkest days of the Cold War, in the late 1940s, actually even then with Henry Wallace, that there was more air for politically and culturally to even have debates within the op-ed pages of the major newspapers. For a particular foreign policy that the United States was advancing. It is, I think it's very different. I think it's this is an incredibly long-winded way of just saying, I think, a peace movement and is facing unusual impediments now for domestic political reasons.
Yeah, I think I agree with you that the acceptable spectrum of debate has seemingly shrunk, and I find that increasingly frightening because of another thing that you focused on, and this is going to be my last question before we open it up. But you spent a lot of time discussing something that I know people on this call are worried about, and that is the threat of nuclear weapons. And one thing that I learned from reading your article was the change in nuclear policy that took place over the last 3 decades in this country and how that looked from the Russian perspective. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, the change from counter value to counter force, the attempt to try and win a nuclear war, and how that looks and how that's affected U.S.-Russia relations.
Well, thank you very much, Ryan, for raising that point. You are, first, all of your comments have been so much more articulate than mine. I wish I should. Your group should just have you talk about this. But
I'm just quoting your article.
That's actually not. Your points about domestic politics are very, very well stated, but I'm very grateful to you for bringing up this nuclear point, because actually you're the first person who's brought this up. This is a large aspect of our article, but it's been ignored by most people who've interviewed me, or by everyone who's interviewed me about this. First, I would say that for me, this looms largest. This is the sort of the most important and frightening aspect of this conflict, and in some ways of the foreign policy course the United States has taken since the end of the Cold War. I was before I was a journalist, I worked at the RAND Corporation, which is a think tank that does work on, among other things, and back then, largely on American nuclear strategy. And I joined RAND, because I was very concerned about, as were many people, about nuclear policy. And I didn't think that I would be able to change that policy at RAND, but I knew that I would learn a lot about it, and I certainly did. And there are many people at RAND who were, who also were very concerned about this. It's not, and this goes back to sort of what we were talking about. This was, a group largely funded by the government. But there was a lot more dissent, and a lot more, to put it again too crudely, a lot more sort of I would actually say that most of the people at RAND were, to one extent or another, nuclear doves. I don't think, as a matter of fact, I know that that's not true. It's that the range of dissent on Ukraine policy today at RAND is not as wide, interestingly. During the Cold War, and I think that there had developed a set of ideas that regarding nuclear deterrence, essentially that the most important thing was to maintain what was called the delicate balance of terror. That since these weapons existed, and since neither party, the United States or the Soviet Union, seemed interested in disarmament, unilateral or otherwise, the important immediate goal was to avoid a nuclear confrontation. And whatever one thinks about this, the set of ideas, they were important, and they did govern the relationship between the United States and Moscow during the Cold War. Essentially that you have to maintain deterrence, and the important way of maintaining deterrence is to make sure that the other side knows that you have a guaranteed retaliatory response. So that there's no way, even if there's no advantage for either side in launching a preemptive nuclear war, because it's unwinnable. And that did largely, a terrifying balance was achieved in that.
Yeah, I hadn't known that it was a common saying, but I learned it from your article. This knowledge that you'd have to trade Berlin for New York.
Yes, and that. So now, so with the end of the Cold War, and this is something that is like, it makes a great deal of sense that the United States was in a position, really a historically unprecedented position, and American foreign policy bankers absolutely understood this and talked about it at great length. It was called the unipolar moment. The United States, there was no, peer competitor to the United States. And the United States' stated goal was to make sure that no peer competitor emerged. So the United States essentially ran the globe, and it wanted to maintain that position. A lot of the measures that the United States took in terms of its foreign policy can be understood given that position and given that goal. Unfortunately, one of the sort of unexplored ways that the United States took advantage of its unipolar moment was to achieve nuclear supremacy, and specifically over its only at the time, its only nuclear rival, which was the former Soviet Union. And the United States, and this is, for reasons that you don't have to you don't even have to subscribe to a view of American policy that is particular, that is grasping and aggrandizing. You have some of the smartest engineers, physicists, and mathematicians in the world working on these nuclear issues. And there is a tendency to if you just let bureaucracies do their own thing, they will make better and better weapons. And by better and better, in this particular case, it means more and more accurate. So the United States was advancing its nuclear capabilities at a time when Russia's nuclear capabilities, because of the economic and turmoil that Russia found itself in after the Cold War, were diminishing. So a gap grew and has continued to exist between America's nuclear capabilities and those of Russia. And this wasn't lost on American policy, or American nuclear strategists recognized this. And some of them were very alarmed by this. And certainly Russian nuclear strategists also recognized this. And this went hand in hand with other things so from Moscow's point of view, Moscow sees that the United States seems to be deliberately upsetting this delicate balance of terror, this desire, or the mechanisms of nuclear deterrence in pursuit of supremacy. And this, from Moscow's point of view, seems to align with a lot of other things that the United States is doing. It's taking a unilateral position on many global security issues. It's sort of rebuffing Moscow's sort of attempts to forge a cooperative relationship on a number of issues, including Afghanistan. and it's expanding NATO. And so again, it's, Russia always regarded as, and I won't go into this, is, sort of like this was a Cold War institution, and rather than disbanding it, you're expanding it, and you're doing this at the very time that you're also not even maintaining the status quo, nuclear status quo, but you seem to be making an effort to achieve nuclear supremacy, and that's by any just by taking the most common sense approach, that seems extremely dangerous and provocative, because it makes Moscow much more ready to and to feel that it might, in a time of crisis, that if and if you look at this somewhat irrationally, that in a time of crisis, if the United States, if it seems to the United States that a war is inevitable, and that this could easily escalate, maybe the best thing to do is to launch a preemptive strike, which makes Moscow's trigger finger much more itchy. So this is just, it's an upsetting and destabilizing development. And in the context of just foreign policy developments, including NATO expansion, it seems, a lot of people I know who don't even necessarily agree with me on Ukraine specifically do recognize that this is a extremely dangerous and needlessly provocative move. That is the American move in Ukraine, given the background of what the United States, the reality of the nuclear balance today.
Thank you for providing that background. It's sorely missed from the mainstream press and the mainstream political conversation, for that matter. I'm going to open it up and give our audience, our activists, and our members a crack at you, Ben. But before I do, I want to bring on screen my colleague Paul Shannon, who's going to tell you all how you can get involved in the Peace in Ukraine campaign. Take it away, Paul. Oh, you got to unmute yourself first.
Thank you, Brian. Brian, I appreciate that. Basically, I don't want to take up a lot of time. We need to change policy on Ukraine. And we have begun a new campaign at Massachusetts Peace Action, which tries to build on the sentiments being expressed in various places around the world, from the Vatican to Brazil, and even in parts of the United Nations, that this war must be ended, and it must be ended now. And that even though ceasefire and negotiations seems impossible right now, we have to believe that that's not the case, and that as this terrible war goes on, more and more people will see that this has to end, from whatever perspective they have about the background of the war, who's good, who's bad, all that type of stuff. This thing just has to end. So we have this campaign. The focus of it is to build sentiment in our country and in our region here in support of the voices calling for ceasefire and negotiations. We ask you to consider participating in this campaign. We have a lot of different parts, from collecting postcards that we're sending to Washington to rallies and all kinds of social media stuff, and letters to the editor, the whole thing. We need everyone's participation, depending on what your particular interests and skills are, of how you will work for peace. And so what I'm going to do is just paste in the chat a link. I hope it goes anyway to a sign-up form. To a sign-up form where you can just maybe make a copy of the link or open it up and sign up and just say you're willing to participate in some way, shape, or form in this opposition to the continuation of the war and for enhancing the voices of people around the world who are calling for ceasefire and negotiations. So that's all I have to say. Please, everyone, consider doing that. And Brian, I think you have one more piece of information.
Sure. This next link that I just put in the chat, and we will send these to you in a follow-up email. So don't worry if you can't get to them right now, but we do encourage you to take action as quick as you can. That link that I just put in will send a message to your representatives, your members of Congress, saying that this sentiment is out here, that constituents want a negotiated settlement to end the killing in Ukraine, that this is all just, it's too dangerous, it's too harmful, and the thing that's going to end this conflict is not ultimate victory for one side or another, but negotiations and peace talks. So please click that and send a message. Tell your senators, tell your member of Congress that you want them to stand up for a peaceful end to this war as soon as possible. Now with that, I want to get to some questions from the audience. To ask your question, go down to the bottom of the screen, hit reactions, and raise your hand. The first person I see is Michael Hoey.
Yeah,
Michael, go ahead.
The question I have deals with the Partnership for Peace that NATO created with Russia in 1994, and that evolved into the NATO-Russia Council. And I'm wondering the role of the color revolutions and then the whole NATO thing, all the stuff that happened in the 90s, how did that lead to where we are today with such animosity among the Russian leadership towards the West?
Well, the Partnership for Peace was sort of a sop that the United States gave to Russia, because Russia was saying, first, Moscow's position was, don't expand NATO. As a matter of fact, disband NATO. This is, we see just the very existence of this anti-Russian, or at least an alliance that was formed against Russia as provocative. We see the incorporation of former members of our alliance into that alliance structure as provocative. This was, Yeltsin's stated position. And then he said, and then Yeltsin's position. And remember, Russia was extremely weak in this period, and the United States, responded to Russia and has responded to Russia throughout, essentially by giving it the back of its hand. Which is that look, President Clinton, directly said to Yeltsin, no, NATO is going to exist and NATO is going to expand. So then Yeltsin said, well, how about if we join NATO? We'll join NATO. And the United States was not interested in having Russia join NATO. So we'll give you this Partnership for Peace. That we're there. You can join. This will be another organization, but look, that was an organization without any power or effectiveness, and especially compared to NATO. So it's you would have to put the creation of the Partnership for Peace in the context of Russia's desire, A, to have NATO dissolve, and B, if NATO isn't going to dissolve, then for Russia, say, its request to join NATO. And as far as the color revolutions go, it depends on which color revolutions we're talking about. But I would say in general that I'll just to put it very, I think from Moscow's point of view, that there is that there's a kind of a familiar pattern where the United States identifies the political elements that are in opposition to Moscow, and perhaps legitimately in opposition to Moscow, as but as not just as elements that the United States is going to support, but as democratic elements that the United States is going to support. Then it becomes part of a general pattern of pro-democracy or promote democracy promotion. The United States funnels support to these political elements that are in opposition to Moscow through both through official channels and through NGOs. And that then when there is some sort of organized opposition, the United States, and again, this is all from Moscow's point of view, supports the opposition forces, and lo and behold, there's a change in regime, and a change in regime. And the new regime is both hostile to Moscow and supportive of the United States. So again, I think it's more complicated than the situation than the way Moscow would see it. But all the elements that Moscow sees are there, so that it's. I think from Moscow's point of view, it would its response to the color revolutions is just, stick to your, this is all to one extent or another in our near abroad, in our neck of the woods, maybe even in our sphere of influence, and therefore just mind your own business and stay out. That I'm not saying the United States would necessarily have to adhere to that position, but it's not in itself a historically unprecedented position that Moscow would be taking.
Thanks, Ben. Next, I want to bring up Harris Grumman.
Thank you, Brian.
Harris, go ahead.
Harris Grumman from the Service Employees International Union. I'm the state political director for Massachusetts, and first of all, I want to say thank you for that article. That article was the best summing up of this situation that I've read anywhere. The article in Harper's, I shared it with innumerable people, and it really captured how I felt the whole thing. As a person who's been watching this since the fall of the Soviet Union with great concern, and the concerns you raised. And I think the thing that's most disturbing, and you touched on it, is this almost like McCarthyism that's going on, but from the left more than the right, although I wouldn't trust the right to be any better on it than the left, as you also pointed out. But the left has created an atmosphere without debate. And I've tested this by using my maximal, influence with senators and congressmen who I played a major role in their elections, with my international president, who I'm very close to and work with. I wrote a very carefully written appeal to each one of them, asking them, can we end the silence on this? Can we, because there's something existential at stake here. Nuclear war, the distraction away from dealing with the climate, the distraction from dealing with our economic inequality in this country. It's so profound. I've never seen anything like it. I mean, I've never been so alienated from my party, my movement, And a lot of it's silence. A lot of it's simply people silent. And of course, it's interesting, nobody responded to the letter directly, only through aides who then got back to me and said, the senator read your letter and he said, he's as dejected about it as I am. But they would not raise it. They wouldn't even raise it with me. They wouldn't put something on paper.
That's exactly, just to interrupt you, I was wondering if, given your, sort of political contacts and the influence that you have, if people are in private more concerned and more skeptical, than their public positions might suggest. And I think what you're saying is that they are.
Yes, they are. But I mean, what's scary is that we've reached a point where we can't bring this out into the open. It cannot be discussed in my union. It cannot be discussed in almost any Democratic Party circle I'm in. It cannot be discussed even among many friends. I mean, because again, you do get accused immediately. I think the context is very important, is what you talked about. I was so conscious in January and February of last year that we were provoking a war. every day I read the New York Times. What are we doing? Joe, what are you doing? Like, you're going to provoke them to a war. This is insane. If they were doing this in Mexico, boom, right? So, all that. And then this happened. So I started saying to people, well, what were we doing the last 2 months? And they all said, you're a Trumpist, or you're a Putin apologist, or you're an appeaser, or you're, Neville Chamberlain. And I mean, really offensively, I was very shocked at the response that I got. And I learned you have to be quiet, because the New York Times every day is telling you there is no other point of view.
Right.
That's why your article is such a breath of fresh air. But I mean, how do we get out of that? I mean, you're an influencer, as the current term of art is. How do we get out of this box we've been put in? It reminds me of my parents in the late 40s, early 50s under McCarthyism. Being
again, I wonder, and I don't want to, I don't want to speak nostalgically of the golden days of McCarthyism, but I don't even I'll just say from my own little experience. I mean, I've been a foreign policy non-interventionist, throughout my adult life, and the major, the New York Times always thought it important to run pieces regularly that dissented from American foreign policy. And the longtime editor, the op-ed page of the New York Times, when I was writing for them fairly regularly, a guy named Mike Levitas. His father was a very prominent Menshevik. He was an anti-Bolshevik man of the left, Mike had absolutely, had no sympathy whatsoever for the Soviet, for the Soviets, but he was a professional journalist, and he would ask me, he'd ask others, we need a dissenting voice on this, or on NATO expansion. I mean, this was going, this is in the even in the early and mid 90s, late 90s. And that, and the reasons, let's put it this way. I mean, it's not as if, again, it's not as if the New York Times ever was it always had a point of view that point of view always did bleed into its reporting. When I agreed with this point of view, I would notice it. When I disagreed with this point of view, I'd notice it. But that paper and has just changed beyond recognition, as has the Washington Post, as the Los Angeles Times. Again, I'm not suggesting that these were ever, that there was ever a period when there was just this, this heroic, unvarnished pursuit of objective truth. But there was an effort. There was a sense, more than a sense that you had to pay lip service to, sort of to that point of view, and to allowing dissenting voices. And the reasons for this, I don't understand. I can't think of a time that there's been such an unhealthy environment for political debate. And so I really share your frustration and despair. And again, I don't know how we, and in some ways, as you're sort of pointing out, that's the worst part of this, is because, yes, I mean, even leaving aside, this isn't going to go away, even if the Ukraine issue is resolved. There's still going to be this kind of monolithic conformity, and it's really, really disturbing.
Yeah, and let me just say, Harris, that as much as we now celebrate the figures who stood against McCarthyism back in the late 40s and early 50s, we deeply appreciate your advocacy and your activism in the face of such, frankly, hurtful criticism. And it just shows how important it is to be courageous.
Yes, no, I really do want to, applaud you because you have a lot more. I mean, you have other issues that you have to deal with these people. I mean, people in political power and you this isn't the only, and you're negotiating, a very sort of difficult set of circumstances, so your courage is really particularly to be applauded.
Well, I mean, every one of us is doing that, and every one of us needs to put something on the line here. I mean, because it is existential. It's calling into question the survival of our civilization and our moral values. I mean, I just am amazed that this has gone into like the jingoism you associate with the opening moves of World War I or something, and not the not. I mean, it's just becoming like you said, it's monolithic, and that's why your voice is so important. It was in a highly placed magazine. It was written very articulately. You have a lot of credentials. You showed a lot of courage, and it's absolutely essential.
But that's really not true, and I don't want to get into a contest with you, but you have other professional obligations that, in other words, that you're not, this isn't the only issue that you're advancing, and you have to always be making the calculation: to what extent is my, if I voice opposition to this, am I jeopardizing the other positions that that I have to take? I would just say that I really did not want to write this article, and that tells you something about the environment in which we're operating. In that, I've written in some ways this a similar article many times. But I saw that there was just no upside, in that I knew it wasn't really going to change the debate, that it's been so frozen. And a lot of people were going to say very bad things about me, which really, I mean, that is, it's like, and as I have to prepare, and especially in the days of social media, with Twitter, etc. It's so much easier for people to say really bad things about you. But I never worried about that. Like I would write about, when I wrote about NATO, the dangers of NATO expansion in the late 1990s. I knew some people would agree with me, some people would disagree with me. It wasn't going to touch off, this, I wasn't going to be called an apologist. Yeah, a traitor. No, exactly.
All right, let's.
And by the way, your analogy you're absolutely right. It's the closest analogy is the First World War. In the United States.
Barbara, if you're still with us, I want to bring you up so you can ask your question.
Well, yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about some of this. One of them, I mean, I'm shocked, not just by the New York Times and so on, but also by the leftist media, which is also terrified of saying anything. And I won't mention any names, but I think what's going on maybe is that people are afraid that if we don't support everything Biden does, we're going to get Trump. Mm-hmm. That's the only thing I can come up with. But I'm just wondering, I mean, if even Jeffrey Sachs cannot get in on the New York Times, then something is really scary. But I'm just wondering, if this nuclear situation is going to make a difference, because Biden needs an off-ramp. He can't, like say, oh, well, I was wrong, because then he may lose the election. So he needs an off-ramp, and maybe this nuclear threat is going to give him an off-ramp. I mean, maybe this will give him a way of negotiating with Russia somehow. Let's hope. I mean, let's hope that something will happen like that. But so, I mean, I'm just wondering why we cannot get through to the leftist media. They're terrified of saying anything. I think they're afraid of, maybe they're afraid of either their funding or of hurting Biden. I'm not quite sure which. But, and by the way, Bernie now is coming out against the weapons industry, which is really great. Today, he came out today with like a really huge attack on the money we're spending on weapons. So basically, I guess that's all. That's all I had in mind at this moment.
Go ahead, Ben, your response to.
Well,
to
no, I
Barbara's
think
comment.
that's a really intelligent assessment. And I wonder, and I'd like to just I'll ask the question and then shut up, because I'd love to hear your response to this. I mean, I do sense, yes, there's clearly a belief that that anything in opposition to Biden is going to help Trump, and therefore we have to kind of rally around Biden. But I do also think that there's been a change in the left, that the left has become, and this is, as always, I'm speaking too crudely, but that the left has become much more muscular, much more truculent. And this goes back to the days of, this is the whole, I mean, if you look at someone like Samantha Power, who I think the left would have happily enfolded her in its embrace, but her doctrine of responsibility to protect, from you can go from a idealistic point of view that we have to stop these human rights abuses to aligning oneself with American foreign policy, to aligning oneself with American military interventionism. And so I think in some ways, yes, the political environment has a lot to do with this, but in some ways, I think, the left itself has, or elements within the left have become more, have embraced a more truculent position. So I'm wondering if you all have sensed that. I think even
yes. To answer your question, one thing in particular that has stood out to me is the lengths that the Bush administration went to prior to the invasion of Iraq to prove, right, that Iraq was a threat to the United States, and the fact that Saddam Hussein was a menace to his own people was secondary. Now with the intervention, with later interventions, with the intervention in Libya, with the intervention in Syria, the case was not even made or attempted that those nations were a threat to the U.S. It was purely on humanitarian interventionism, which for me is just another term for crusading, and which I find in many ways even more dangerous because it's there's less rules.
Exactly.
I want to get to, we have two more questions and then we can let you get out of here. You spent a lot of time with us and we do appreciate it. Joan, if you're still with us, if you could unmute yourself and ask your question. Joan may have stepped away. So I'll go to you, Elizabeth. If you could just unmute yourself, I'll bring you up on screen.
Did. Yeah, I think I am unmuted, aren't I?
You are indeed. Go ahead with your question.
Right. Yeah, I want to talk again about the mainstream media. Chomsky has said that he has never seen in his lifetime, or at least in the last 50 or 60 years, how the mainstream media has had one voice. There's no opposition. You go to the mainstream media, there's no one on there that's saying anything else. And another thing I want to point out is that there are some Republicans who are questioning why we're in Iraq. Why doesn't the left try to support that?
Well,
why doesn't some of the supposedly progressives in Congress support them. Because I think that is the only way we're going to get out of this, is if we have support from the Republicans. What, you know, whatever else they say, that's another thing. But there are some, in fact, one of the people now is putting up some resolution about the money to the Pentagon, and asking, what is the purpose of this war? Why are we there? And
Yeah,
so
I think specifically
that,
what you're.
yeah,
Kind of much, I think.
Go ahead. I
Right.
think you may be referring to an amendment that was just voted on, and I hear it will be introduced as a standalone bill
Right.
by Warren Davidson, who's actually a Republican
I
from
know.
Ohio, asking, what's the plan here? How
Yeah,
much do you think this is going to cost? What about next year? And to my knowledge, that has received zero Democratic support
Yeah,
so far.
that-
So that's a
that tells
job
you-
for us all as advocates.
Yeah, that
Thank you for
tells you,
bringing
I
that
think
up,
that
Melissa.
tells you everything, unfortunately.
Yeah, very important. What's your take on that? What's your take on what it will take to move some of these progressive Democrats who are very against forever wars to be against this forever?
Well, I think again, you all have just raised really just vital points. And it's just so refreshing to hear so many people in one in one place with whom I agree, completely. There are, I mean, there's always a I think that and with the last question, I was first going to say that I know that there are elements on the people who call themselves political conservatives and who are sincerely troubled by the same aspects of American this crusading mentality, the muscular, sort of bullying aspects of American foreign policy, and the non-democratic aspects of American foreign policy that elements of the left are also troubled by. I think there are, and when there should be more of a political coalition. I wish something like that really could develop. I'll just say I know a prominent former editor of a very prominent left-wing magazine who made great efforts to forge such a coalition, that certainly but there was a lot of opposition within that magazine to that. It's I don't know what it will take. But I think it's important to know that, and in this way, people on the left should, while there are elements on the, there are elements on the left and there are elements on the right that are in broad agreement, but the establishment position of both political parties is speaking in a completely different language, so that but I have to say that and I'm not in any way applauding even someone like Tucker Carlson, but Tucker Carlson, I mean, when I heard him talk about American interventionism generally, the war in Ukraine specifically, I cannot disagree with with almost anything he said. And he absolutely took it, he was aiming a lot of his most vicious criticism the Republican establishment. And now, again, I can't think of someone on the political left with any kind of, similar profile who's done the same with the Democratic establishment. But I just don't know. I would say that whatever hope there would be in any kind of normal times for any kind of coalition on this issue to form, that's just impossible given in the current environment. And that again, what looms behind all of that to me is Donald Trump, and as you all pointed out, that the last thing anyone, it's like, it's a real, it's whatever one thinks about Donald Trump, even if one supported Donald Trump and supported him for his ostensible views on foreign policy, that those views on foreign policy have been permanently marginalized because of Donald Trump.
Well said. I'm going to give the last question, and if you could make it a quick one, to Frank, if you could unmute yourself. Go ahead, Frank.
Yeah, thank you, Brian and Benjamin. I'm going to voice an opinion that is very contrary to most of what I'm hearing, certainly from Benjamin and from Brian. I'm very proud that I am a liberal Democrat, and I'm very proud of what we're doing to address our leadership in regards to the bad guy and the better guy, the bad guy and the good guy. I would be ashamed if we didn't have the leadership to go in and do what President Biden is doing and giving the leadership to NATO and providing the arms that are being provided. I think that's the correct thing to do. And I'm terribly proud of us as a country and as a people in doing this. And I'm sorry to hear the amount of opposition that has been expressed this evening.
Mm-hmm.
But we've all got a right in this country of ours to express it.
Yeah, and you are certainly welcome here. Let me say that, Frank. But your comments, Ben?
Yep.
Well, again, it's extremely healthy and important that all sides in any political debate and discussion be heard. And Frank, I'm going to do you the honor of not just applauding your dissent, but to an extent of challenging it. I assume you were against the war in Vietnam. Is that a correct assumption? Why were you against that war?
Well, it's difficult saying, Benjamin, because I think the amount of information that has been provided about what McNamara and Johnson particularly did in misleading the people of the United States is shameful. I was against it for that point. With the direction that Vietnam was heading, I saw no real benefit of going in to Vietnam. I can speak from a practical point of view as my role at that time in it. I'm ashamed that we went into Vietnam, but I think it was the wrong decision, and it was the wrong decision for some of the reasons that I've just said.
Mm-hmm. Mhm. Well, I would just say, and I don't want to, prolong, this evening too much, but the first point you raised was the deception of the American government regarding the war, and what I think you're really talking about is the misleading statements that the Johnson administration frequently made about the degree of progress in achieving its stated aims. Absolutely, the Johnson administration was guilty on that point, as the Pentagon Papers elucidated. It was guilty largely because the Johnson administration believed, my God, this is going to be an incredibly difficult undertaking. The forces that, and we may or may not win, but it's very important that we, for all sorts of reasons, that we make the effort. Again, I think the important point is that the Johnson administration thought that there were important reasons for American interests in the pursuit of its foreign policy, that it make that effort. Clearly, and I don't want the administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt absolutely lied about the degree to which it was involved in what it privately acknowledged was a shooting war in the North Atlantic with Nazi Germany in 1940, 1941. It lied because it believed that there were very important, vital security and foreign policy interests involved, and that it had to get ahead of the public opinion on this matter.
Benjamin, if I can interrupt you just a second.
Sure.
When you used Vietnam and you used World War II with Roosevelt, how do you see those as being comparative examples to what's going on currently with Russia and our support of Ukraine?
Right. No, I'll get to that, but that's an important point. I think the point that I'm raising is that, in some instances, people applaud an administration for lying, and in some instances, people castigate an administration for lying. I think the difference lies in that now you have to see that, in retrospect, most Americans think that there were important national security interests involved, and therefore it was okay for the Roosevelt administration to lie. And now many Americans believe there weren't, in retrospect, important national security interests for the United States in Vietnam, but the lying itself existed in both cases. So lying as a foreign policy tool is not really a good reason in itself to oppose a foreign policy. All administrations lie. All administrations lie grossly. This administration absolutely lied. And it said that, say, for instance, clearly the bombing of Nord Stream was a Russian act. All the earmarks of a Russian act. Whether we still don't know who bombed Nord Stream, but the administration knows prior to that attack that it had intelligence information from its own allies that Ukraine was planning that move. So it certainly didn't have all the earmarks of a Russian attack. It had all the earmarks from what the administration knew of a Ukrainian attack. The administration lied. I don't really blame the administration for lying, as I expect the administration to lie, but I wouldn't oppose or support a foreign intervention based on the duplicity of an American government. But the reason I asked you about Vietnam was because you talked about, and in a really smart way, you didn't say, at first you said good guys or bad guys and better guys. And then I think you actually revised that and said bad guys and good guys. But I'll even like take your first definition of good guys and better guys, sort of acknowledging that that Zelensky and and his government might not be all that it's touted to be, but that in comparison to Russia, to the regime, to the domestic regime in Russia, it's better. I'll stipulate that I agree with you on that. But I think without question, I mean, I was against the war in I was just a tiny kid, but I was against the war in Vietnam because my parents were very much against the war in Vietnam. But I know a great deal about the war in Vietnam. There's no question that if you're talking about, on the one hand, you had a government in South Vietnam that was corrupt, that was not responsive to the people, but that was not murderous and authoritarian. Choosing my words carefully, I would say that the government of North Vietnam was murderous and authoritarian. And now I'm not saying that it was not in some ways motivated by idealistic and worthy goals, but that in practice, I think that if you're just going to make morally relative judgments, that I think that, and I don't really think that anyone would seriously dispute that the relative moral better guys would be the South, not the North. That doesn't make the American decision to involve itself in a war. And again, if you're talking about aggression, there's no question this was known at the time. There's no, since there were the regular North Vietnamese forces invaded South Vietnam. It violated what was understood to be a recognized international boundary. Now, again, though, I don't want to go. I mean, international law is a double-edged sword. It's always, but I don't really see how someone could have opposed the war in Vietnam and supported this war for the reasons that you're, that you were very, articulately, stated. Lying on the part of a government and the relative moral, weight of the adversaries. Again, I don't want to have the last word here, and I know that I'm sure that you could, that there's a very effective retort that you can make. But I think if this is the last word, I hope that at least you reflect on my response.
Let me just say, and I know we've kept you way beyond time, Frank, I really appreciate your question, and I encourage you to come back and continue to be a part of this conversation. We want to talk to folks who believe what you believe, and maintain a dialogue. But just in closing, I want to thank you for being with us, Ben. Your article, it really was much bandied about, much shared, much discussed in the peace movement.
Well, I'm really glad. I'm really glad it was.
I think what it provided is something that's really, really missed, and that helps see from the point of view of an adversary, which is incredibly important in conflict resolution and peace work and diplomacy. and that's historical perspective. Thank you so much. I know that it has helped our work. And the final question I'll ask of you is, how can people on this call support your work?
Well, just the way you have. I mean, it's extremely heartening to me, and I will definitely report to. I mean, I would say, one way that you could, letters to Harper's would be very helpful, and I'll be very frank about this. The publisher of Harper's, John, he goes by Rick MacArthur, is a long time. He agrees with us on a lot of. I mean, he's of the left and has been an anti-interventionist from the beginning. He thought it's very important that that an article like this come out in his magazine. He's gotten, I'm just a schmuck with a typewriter. But Rick has a lot of people both within Harper's and in his circle, we're very, very unhappy with this article. So it would, and I think I think he felt that it was kind of he felt it was important to do, but I think any words of of support, I think he would really welcome and appreciate. And I just want to say in closing, just I think this goes with all of us here, and Frank, I hope you're listening. Frank, almost everyone who I count as a friend agrees with you and disagrees with me. I mean, so it's not, and I think we all understand that this is, both that, that people that we like and admire don't agree with us on this issue. Many, many people, and that, it's important to, maintain a dialogue and respectful debate, even knowing that ultimately we'll probably never are going to see eye to eye on this, but I'm probably making an inference, but I think a correct one, that you all have the same, have a similar experience, that a lot of people in your circles, social and professional and otherwise, don't agree with you on Ukraine, but we have to be as respectful of the people who disagree with us as that as many of them are, and we hope more of them will be of political dissent.
Very well said. And let me just say, we have a letters to the editor club, and we will take you up on that. We will be.
That would be great. It would really be. Again, because Harper's does see itself as a magazine of the left, and it is taking a lonely position on this issue. So it would, I think, be really great for it to know that not everyone sees it as a betrayal of the left to run this piece.
Well, thank you so much for spending so much time with us, Ben. And
you guys are doing great work. And
thank you so much.
We
look forward to your next piece.
Right. Thanks a lot.
Have a great night.
Okay, you too. Good night.
Bye-bye. And I just want to thank everyone for staying with us for our fascinating conversation. We will be sending out a follow-up email with the recording, as well as some of the important links that were shared, and some of the great articles that were shared in the chat as well. So thank you so much for being with us. This was a great conversation, and thanks to everyone who asked a question, because you helped make it one. All right, and with that, I will say good night.